Hello, my name is Erin McBrien, and I am the Interim Curator of the Upper Midwest Literary Archives. Today I present The Revolution Will Be Postmarked, a deep dive into Robert Bly's protest and demonstration activity during the Vietnam War, particularly how that activity was organized via correspondence. All the documents I show you today can be found in the Robert Bly papers. First, a brief note about UMLA. The Upper Midwest Literary Archives began in 1971 under Al Lathrop as part of the former Manuscripts Division. Our mission is to preserve and provide access to the literary culture of the Upper Midwest. This includes collecting both the personal and professional papers of local writers, which covers all aspects of their lives. Robert Bly's papers are a great example of how the collections can contain multitudes. They are a strong literary collection devoted to the craft of poetry, and they are a contemporary view of protest during the most contentious foreign war in American history. They are a blending of the artistic and the political. For context, I have here an extremely brief timeline of the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. Most of the documents I discuss today are dated between 1966 to 1969, which appear to be the peak of Bly's protest activity. However, his dissent against the war started well before 1966 and extended up to the end of the conflict. So who am I talking about today when I talk about protesters? The people we see most often within the Bly papers, the people organizing the protests, were like Bly himself. They were white, middle class, and middle-aged men and women who are largely academics and creatives. It is vital to remember that protesters are not a monolith. Because of this, what I show you today isn't the total of protest or protesters during the Vietnam War, and socioeconomic class impacts how people were able to protest and how they were treated by those in power. Up on the screen, I have two calls to action that were distributed via post. One of them begins with "The young men who are drafted may not be our sons and grandsons," and goes on to say, "We ourselves are too old to be drafted," and makes an appeal that despite not being at risk of violence themselves, these protesters still stand against the violence done to other human beings, whether Vietnamese or American. The other call to action declares that the protesters hope to circulate this throughout the academic, professional, and religious communities, and that they hope to gain the support of men like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend William Sloane Coffin, and Dr. Benjamin Spock. They take for granted that an educated middle class would be against the Vietnam War and would listen to the voices of reverends and doctors. These sensibilities can be seen in many of the personal letters addressed to Bly as well, which speculate on reasons for the Vietnam War that range across capitalistic interests to the 20th century imperialism. Okay. Pausing. Okay. Resuming. Retake of the last line. These sensibilities can be seen in many of the personal letters addressed to Bly as well, which speculate on reasons for the Vietnam War that range across capitalistic interests and 20th century imperialism. And back up. The demographic of the protesters is especially clear when reading the request to organize read-ins. Read-ins were Bly's primary form of protest, a gathering of people who would read and listen to anti-war poetry. The requesters are largely professors and students, usually from English departments, located in college towns. Most of the professors were personal friends or colleagues of Bly. They were published writers as well as instructors. The students were often aspiring poets who had heard about Bly's read-ins from friends, the news, or disseminated resistance literature. The letters on the screen are just a selection of the hundreds of read-in requests that can be found in the Bly papers. They range in tone from professional to personable, including a postcard that asks Bly to include Kent State in his Ohio tour. One of my favorites is the letter forwarded to Bly by a professor that expresses a student's interest in participating in read-ins. As you can see, there is a note on the bottom that reads, "Returned very bad poems." That's a bummer. But then who is going to read? Here we have one of Bly's handwritten lists brainstorming who might want to participate in a read-in, including names such as Galway Kimball and George Plimpton. You can also see a letter from another organizer listing poets that they know are already interested. Big names like Adrian Rich, Allen Ginsberg, and Bly himself were the main attractions during these events. The headliners were people who would draw in those that didn't already have a vested interest in protest. They also brought the most media attention, which helped spread the anti-war message further. Apart from them, readers could be professors at the hosting institutions, local writers, or aspiring students who wanted to do their part for the resistance, as well as appear alongside the most famous poets of their day. My favorite image on this slide is this snippet of a list that says Arthur Miller on tape, which feels like the 1960s equivalent of a keynote speaker zooming in to present at an event. While famous poets were an important part of read-ins, they also required the most logistics. Tour schedules were frequently mailed out to the headliners that listed notable participants, dates, times, tour locations, and contacts for each city a read-in was planned. Contacts were particularly important because they were often the people hosting traveling poets, as well as chauffeuring them around the city. Most other details listed on tour schedules included how many people were expected and whether readers were being compensated. On screen, there are two schedules. One lists May tour dates back to back that cross New York State, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Wisconsin. The other covers April dates and locations that range from Portland to Santa Barbara to Minneapolis. Every one of the locations had an estimated attendance between 800 and 1,000. This is my favorite tour schedule. It starts off apologizing for being a Xeroxed letter and goes on to explain logistics for a series of read-ins. The cities listed are Portland, Santa Barbara, Minneapolis, Chicago, Boulder, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Milwaukee. If that sounds intense to you, imagine how it sounded to Bly. As you can see, the letter is addressed to him for your nightmares. Of course, these kinds of large-scale demonstrations don't just happen. Performance venues and traveling cost a pretty penny, not to mention the expenses of providing an honorarium to famous poets, acquiring permits, occasionally paying bail for protesters, and printing flyers, posters, and tickets. According to this expense sheet, ticket sales appear to have been the main source of income for war resistance groups, followed at a distant second by financial gifts from the universities they read at. I have two letters on screen that discuss the difficulty of receiving money from universities. As I'm sure will surprise no one, it seems to have been as easy as squeezing blood from a stone. Income from read-ins was split between the local resistance chapter and the national movement, and appears to have been put towards funding more demonstrations or donated to larger anti-war and war relief charities. Now for the fun part. Included in requests to host read-ins were usually scraps of poems. They range widely in length, style, and quality, but all were about the war in Vietnam. Most of the poems appear to have been unsolicited, and I can't find any evidence that Bly worked with them at all. There are some, however, where multiple copies have been exchanged, including a few with visible edits and notations. Bly was known for his stringent adherence to his own personal school of poetry, so it's not surprising he was selective about who he worked with. Alongside the poetry selections, there was frequent correspondence between organizers regarding talking points, visuals, quotes from philosophers and famous speakers, and open questions posed to the crowd. This letter to Robert suggests asking the audience, if anyone in the world today were to shout, "Give me liberty or give me death," who would it be? Where does he live? What is his nationality? And then rather dryly says that this is perhaps inflammatory. Poets weren't the only ones involved in read-ins, however. Folk music and performance art often accompanied poetry and speeches. This document states that the read-in will be performed by writers and actors, some of the best creative minds and spirits of our time. On one of his crowded brainstorming papers, Bly lists the name Bobby Dylan in a corner, most likely as a reminder to invite the musician to perform at a demonstration. I think this is pretty cute because I don't think of Bob Dylan as being young, but Bobby Dylan sounds really young to age myself. Because of the connections made through read-ins, it's no surprise that other forms of creative protest arose. One example of this was Angry Arts Week, which was originally held in 1967 on the streets of New York City. We can see from this letter that Robert Bly attended as a panel moderator for The War, the Artist, His Work, which was part of the napalm poetry readings. Napalm readings were much like other read-ins, but in some cases even more volatile. They focused heavily on violence done by firebombing and chemical warfare with an emphasis on civilian casualties. The event description seen here includes that admissions went to benefit children in Vietnam. The other documents I have on screen right now include a mail-in form that said whether you wanted to receive correspondence about Angry Arts, as well as what the back of event planning stationery looked like. These columns are all titles of protest art happening in New York City that week. Demonstrations during Angry Arts Week varied greatly, including songs, speeches, readings, photography exhibits, and experimental performance art. One of my favorite incidents is described after the fact in this letter. It reads, 25 of us went out on a platform truck with sound equipment and a gigantic billboard with a two-headed Johnson on it, second head emerging from his buttocks, and hit 5 locations with songs, poems, and a skit. Despite, or perhaps because of, how shocking that might sound, Angry Arts Week was wildly successful. In a debriefing letter received 2 months later, the Angry Arts organizers reported that 62,000 people attended structured events, with 10,000 additional at the Loeb Student Center where the napalm poetry readings were held, and that countless others experienced unstructured protest art traveling around the New York City metro. These are these all they also report taking again. They also report that Angry Arts Weeks were being planned in Chicago, D.C., and Philadelphia, and that exhibits from the New York Angry Arts Week traveled to Colorado, Pittsburgh, and Oregon. Many, many new Angry Arts Weeks were planned in college towns all over the country by politically minded students. The letter on the right of the screen is from a student requesting advice and a possible reading from Bly at her university's intended Angry Arts Week. The New York City Draft Center sit-in was one of the few forms of Bly's political demonstration that did not involve art. It is, however, one of the strongest examples of the importance of correspondence to planning and executing a protest. The documents shown on screen now are a call to action, details of the date, time, and place for the protest, including a map of the specific location in New York, lists of local contacts who would provide housing and directions for out-of-state participants, and even how to sign up for a 5:30 a.m. wake-up phone call from organization volunteers. The amount of logistics for this one day is incredible, and the vast majority of details could only go through the mail. They were too intricate and needed to be disseminated too broadly to be conveniently shared over the phone. And it was an incredible success. Hundreds of people arrived at the induction center to block draft processing. We even have proof that Robert Bly attended the protest. On the left, you can see the envelope that held Bly's personal effects when he was detained by New York City police. He was one of the over 250 people arrested. It's important to note that this arrest didn't pose much of an inconvenience on him, however, and he was shortly released. One connection I wanted to highlight between correspondence and protest is the stationery itself. Protesters showed their allegiance through letterheads that listed organizing members, stamps, and custom envelopes marked with the names of anti-war groups. Even entire backs of pages were dedicated to listing anti-war projects these groups helped finance. The note you see on the left here even lists colleges that Bly considered sending resistance stationery to. And you can see these two columns on that page are all projects that were funded by the resistance activities of these different groups. This leads us to focus more on letters from individuals regarding the war rather than letters focused on organizing protest. I thought it was important to show these because it demonstrates just how invasive the war was every day. I felt this letter was especially vital to share. It is addressed to Bly by a young Marine fighting in Vietnam named Lieutenant Corporal G. Roland Wood. The whole letter is remarkable, but I'm going to share a couple of the moments that resonated with me most. Firstly, when speaking of the Marines, he says, "If I am ever to be anything like a whole and conscious man, I've got to get out of this den of stupidity and power. Such a complete example of everything I'm fighting to help prevent." Most of the letter is like this. It is critical of the American military, particularly the Marines, and it demonstrates a visceral homesickness, as well as a resentment that he had to pause his education. He goes on to say, "In August I will go home. Odds are I'll go home alive now. Only 8 of our entire platoon walked off Hill 861 on March 17th. This correlates with much of the protest rhetoric within Bly's circles, the fear for and anger at the waste of young men's lives. This was not the sum of anti war protests during this time, but perhaps due to their demographics, older, with children and grandchildren, it is a common refrain among the protesters Bly was involved with. Finally, I want to include this statement. "We kill damn few Vietnamese civilians and are lenient to an insane degree with the Viet Cong we capture." Despite the horrors that were perpetrated by the United States military, it's important to remember that those weren't the actions of most individual soldiers. As you can see on screen, I've highlighted a comment Bly wrote on the envelope, which says, "I read part of this, oh my God," as well as one of G. Roland Wood's funniest statements, which is, "And screw popular opinion, incidentally, except that Johnson is a turd. LBJ does not appear to have been well loved at this time." Most of the letters found within the Robert Bly papers are anti-war and complimentary of Bly. This isn't at all surprising. These are the letters he chose to keep, after all, and it is natural that his collection reflects his biases. I have no way of knowing whether he received and trashed any amount of hate mail, but I did find a few letters that were most certainly not following along with the Robert Bly party line. The two the top left letter shown is from a couple who attended one of Bly's anti-war talks, and it expresses their frustration with his glossing over of the causes for the Vietnam War. They particularly point out that while all wars are complicated, they are often begun by a simple act of aggression. As they put it, it was North Vietnam that sent troops into South Vietnam and not the reverse. The letter below this is from a friend and fellow writer who appears to feel similarly about the war, but warns Bly away from interacting with an acquaintance who was a communist, or a different man who is not a communist, but the communists around Minneapolis like to think he is one of their children, and he for years has served as these minerals and vitamins in their depleted and eroded political diet. While Bly was not a communist, he also didn't fear or hate communism in the same way as many others, and being associated with communists was a touchy subject among war resistors. Finally, the document on the right is from a fellow literary journal publisher in response to a letter he received from Bly. It is easily the most censorious. "I am not a politician and do not know of right or wrong about Vietnam. I only care. I am sure if you will take time out for masturbating your ego, you will realize you know less about it than I. One does not need to know details about a war, who starts one or who finishes it, to feel a loyalty to his country regardless of its shortcomings. He needs only to have fought in one and once have dirtied his hands at bastonage." He ends this letter with a statement that, in my opinion, undermines these sentiments. "Thanks again for your kind words about Podium. I am glad you think it has life. It is also glad to live here, in America, where we do not have to see the ugliness of our 17-year-old sons being murdered by 16-year-old Vietnamese peasants." The issue of not seeing ugliness, not being in active danger, was one of the things most opposed by protesters of Bly's stripe. You shouldn't have to be seeing and fearing violence to oppose it done by other human beings. Where there is protest and dissent against authority, there are invariably those elements that fall into conspiracy. While this is far from most of Bly's correspondence, and he himself does not seem to agree with these schools of thought, I wanted to include some of my wilder findings. Here we have an offhand mention of someone still tampering with my mail, possibly as a joke. In the letter below, though, there is a far more earnest report of not being allowed to post an ad in the newspaper because they told me that the FBI checks out all their ads as special code possibilities. The ad taker said, "I'm sure they caught one spy the other day," which sounds like the plot of a Cold War movie to me. The letter on the right includes some fascinating speculation about the assassination of JFK, a conspiracy theory classic. After sitting through this presentation, it will surprise none of you that the suspected mastermind is Lyndon B. Johnson. After going through Bly's notes, however, I personally don't believe anyone spying on him would have been able to glean the details of his resistance activities. And he was one of the more organized dissenters. The three documents on the screen now are some of his read-in planning notes. At most, they are a list of random names and phone numbers scattered across the page with no apparent reason, punctuated by sudden unrelated thoughts, and written in his very cramped handwriting. And that's before his children got a hold of the paper. Here you can see evidence of practicing numbers and letters, as well as childhood doodles on the page. I only realized this had anything to do with planning a read-in because it was in the same folder as a bunch of organization correspondence. The Robert Bly papers offer a view on a figure of startlingly political and artistic significance, as well as an invaluable look on protest during an age of print and analog technologies. Despite everything I've shown you today, there is so much more that I didn't have time to cover. There are all the anti-Vietnam War publications, including the time Bly was almost sued by E. E. Cummings' widow. There's the fascinating phenomena of the writers and editors' war tax protest, the March on the Pentagon, the entire Artists of Conscience movement, and this probably the most public of Bly's civil disobedience. There are the records of his acceptance speech during the National Book Awards, as well as his refusal of the prize money. Though these are the records of an individual, they contribute to a history of protest that makes us quintessentially American. If you have interest in perusing the Robert Bly papers or other collections from the Upper Midwest Literary Archives, please feel free to pick up a brochure or a business card and get in contact. Regardless, thank you for joining me and have a great rest of your first Friday.
Thank you all for attending this afternoon and online. Again, my name is Katelyn Morken, and I am the Research Services and Student Life Archivist within the University of Minnesota Archives, and I will be presenting on the campus message board, Communications from the University of Minnesota. As I walk to school each morning, there's a billboard which I pass. That is sometimes so exciting, I am rather late to class. Just the other day I saw there a pathetic, dreadful scene. 'Twas the man in Through the Breakers, struggling in an ocean green. As I walked on full of terror, wondering if the man would die, "Do you know you need a biscuit?" fell upon my tear-dimmed eye. Yes, I knew I needed something, but good gracious, what was that? A bold cowboy with a pistol cried, "Give up that Gordon hat." And so on in quick succession, varied pictures met my gaze. This one tragic, this one comic, in an awful poster craze. Purple ground and yellow water, grass of blue and skies of green, maidens with bright scarlet tresses in a poster may be seen. This poster, titled Posters, was written by a student named Jim and was featured in the April 29, 1899 issue of the Ariel, the first student newspaper at the University of Minnesota. At that time, posters, notices, and other announcements were visible on campus as the regents had provided bulletin boards across campus, including one in the main building, the engineering building, the medical building, and the law building. But that did not stop others from nailing their announcements and advertisements to the campus oaks, leaving the trees to look more like public signboards than nature intended. Despite the access to bulletin boards, the oak trees became a commonplace to hang such announcements, as you can see here in the picture of Burton Hall from 1906 and the small sign nailed to the tree out front. Despite on the use of campus trees for advertising continued through the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, many students found the act of posting on a trunk as vandalism. While others found that by having posters on trees, the students would, quote, almost unconsciously absorb the information contained on the posters, which he, the student, would otherwise get only by close study of a crowded bulletin board. In this way, each student undoubtedly saves 4 minutes a day, 20 a week, 80 a month, 720 a year, and 2,404 students in a year save 1,730,880 minutes or 28,848 hours. 28,848 hours chopped out of the span of a life. And some reformer wants to abolish posters on the trees? End quote. This opinion, found in the Ariel on January 25th, 1896, was penned by none other than student Bill Poster. So as the discussion continued between students and administrators, it was finally announced on May 14th, 1903, by President Northrop that the Board of Regents had decided that no more posters may be placed on campus trees, and then found that the superintendent of the grounds would remove them. Furthermore, by the mid-1910s, guidelines around recognizing student organizations on campus were created, and the discussion around advertising on campus and using university bulletin boards was further formalized. It was stated that on April 2nd, 1914, in the Senate Committee on Student Affairs meeting minutes regarding recognizing student organizations, that if the Senate Committee does not recognize such an organization, that it be refused a listing in student organization lists whenever published, that it be refused a meeting place on the campus, that it be refused permission to appear in the Gopher, that it not be allowed to use the university name in any attempt to secure patronage, and that it be refused to the use of the university bulletin boards. Outside of the bulletin boards on campus, students also disseminated their posters and flyers through the university's post office. On November 15th, 1915, the Senate Committee on Student Affairs spoke on the use of campus mailing for advertising purposes. The meeting minutes state that it was the sentiment of the committee that a certain amount of liberty be given to official university organization in use of the post office at the request and discretion of Mr. Poucher, the director of service enterprises at that time. 40 years later, it was noted in the student handbook that other printed notices may be placed in a student's union post office box by organizations seeking students' participation. Student groups simply had to provide a sample copy of the material being distributed to the Student Activities Bureau and fill out an approval form to be signed by an SAB member prior to being placed in the mailboxes. The Student Activities Bureau also addressed the use of campus mailing by external businesses and organizations in the post office material approvals in November of 1950 by allowing non-commercial posters and flyers to be circulated through students' PO boxes so long as non-university organizations, businesses worked in charity or social service, and that it be distributed by a recognized student organization as part of a project or collaborative effort. Similarly, it wasn't until 1970 when faculty in SAB began reviewing their poster policy more closely that Blake Biles, an advisor to political and social action groups, addressed this issue of non-university or non-student groups having access to the bulletin boards in a memorandum to Don Sander, the Associate Vice President in the Office of Student Affairs, and Lutz Boiler, the Director of the Student Activities Bureau, on September 17, 1970. Biles writes, I realize that the poster policy is meant to apply to students and student groups. I am not clear on whether or not non-student organizations have access to any of the bulletin boards covered, no pun intended, by this policy. I'm thinking not only of non-university groups, but also of non-student university organizations, such as faculty organizations, civil groups, etc. The trajectory of this timeline illustrates how communication through the form of posters and flyers was a fundamental occurrence throughout the span of the university's existence. And today, I will be sharing a few examples of these types of communication that emphasize student organizations, university services, and external advertisements, all of which can be found within the recently processed posters, broadsides, and flyers collection. To begin, a bulk of material found in the posters, broadsides, and flyers collection contain a representation of student and faculty groups who are advocating for political or social activism on campus. Their support for a cause was usually visible through a rally, demonstration, a teach-in, or protest on campus. As early as 1937, student groups such as the Practical Pacifist Club served as a student group that strove for peace amongst the effects of World War II. 30 years later, and student groups were fighting for a similar movement, but by the late 1960s and early 1970s, it was against the Vietnam War. Student groups such as the Anti-War Coalition and the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars were established out of the anti-war movement on the University of Minnesota campus. In both instances in time, these student groups physically created and produced the posters and flyers themselves, making sure to include the day, time, and location of their event so that students, faculty, and the campus community were informed appropriately. In other cases, similar to the example of the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars, a detailed account of resources available to those participating in the anti-war movement, documentation of a student group's reasoning behind their actions, as well as a list of student groups' demands to the university, could be found on a double-sided flyer. Because of this, these posters and flyers were made to be found and distributed amongst the campus community so that even information or student group documentation could be disseminated. For the sake of the Anti-War Coalition and the Committee for Concerned Asian Scholars, their activity resolved primarily around the anti-war demonstrations in May 1972. And at that time, because the first kiosk was placed in front of Jones Hall in 1967, known then as the Physics Building, foot traffic by students on the mall was inevitable. Both the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars and the Anti-War Coalition were able to hang posters on the kiosks leading up to the events of the May 1972 anti-war demonstrations. After the course of 7 days of demonstrations and a response by student organizations and the campus community to President Nixon's decision to amplify the bombings in Vietnam, the University of Minnesota and the local police officers were called in to monitor the events. Due to the escalation of the activism and the police involvement, a commission of inquiry for the campus anti-war demonstrations was established. Thereafter, to review the extent of events that happened on the University of Minnesota campus. At each committee executive session, the accounts and testimonies were recorded, not only for committee members to have a way to listen back in the event that they were not present at the actual session, but also to, quote, become part of the university archives, part of the permanent record. Since then, these 26 continuous recordings have been digitized, were thoroughly listened to, and accurately described by my colleague, Rebecca Tuve, Collections Archivist for University Archives, and are now available on the digital repository, UMedia. At the session on July 7th, 1972, Robert Ross of the Office of Student Affairs had provided this account of the week-long events, and when questioned if or how he kept his office informed of the demands asked by student groups and demonstrators, his reaction is very telling to the effect of posters and flyers had at that time. Here is Ross's answer. I want to do away with the idea of mystery and secrecy and so on. It's all leafleted and hand-built. All you have to do is walk down the mall and you can find anything you want to know because, hooray for the mimeograph machines. It's simply a fact of life. And our knowledge is not obtained in the sense of going out with the idea that we will sit at a meeting and come out of it with the secret kinds of information that belong to nobody else. We wait, we find out, we may know ahead of time, but by the time a meeting is over, the leaflets are being distributed. There is just not that much secrecy. So I really want to do away with this idea that we're in the business of collecting information that is somehow top secret, because it just doesn't work that way. From Robert Ross's testimony, it was disclosed to the committee members that the students and student groups involved with the anti-war demonstrations on campus were being transparent about their actions leading up to their rallies and protests, that there were no secrets to their opinions and actions as they were creating and disseminating and posting their course of actions across campus in order to communicate their purpose. Other student-led groups such as recreational clubs and multicultural centers utilized campus mail and the bulletin boards to communicate and advocate for student engagement within their groups. Many of these examples serve as promotional material to describe their club activity, but others advertised an event they were sponsoring or for their next chapter meeting. Posters such as the Rodeo Club, the Keeley International Folk Dance Student Group, or the Alpha Kappa Psi Fraternity were promoting events that represent what that club or group was hosting and actively engaged in. Be it the Gopher Stampede of 1975, folk dancing classes, or a fraternity party, students were aware of these events happening due to their creation, dissemination, and posting across campus. Similarly, many of the multicultural and international centers and student associations utilized flyers and posters as a way to share information on their group and to reach new incoming students. Here are two examples from the Hong Kong Student Association from 1974 on your left, and the Chinese Student Center Service Center from 1978 on your right. This was also an opportunity for these students to create their posters and flyers with unique design elements relevant to their event or group. Much like other posters and flyers that I will share today, creating original illustrations could help a poster or flyer stand out amongst other postings and for further awareness by the students. It wasn't just students using posters and broadsides to communicate to one another. Other ways that the communication was being advertised to the campus community was through departmental announcements, university services, and extracurricular posters and flyers. Posters such as the Sensational U of Minnesota, Galloping Gophers Are Coming from 1935, or the band activities at Minnesota from 1949 could have been seen on campus near Memorial Stadium or outside of the music building, Scott Hall. Both of these types of posters would communicate to current and prospective students about the extracurricular activities that they could be involved in during their 4 years at the University of Minnesota. And this is evident as in on the top right-hand corner of the marching band's poster, it states, "Please post your hand to bandmen planning to attend the University of Minnesota this fall." Signs advertising for evening classes such as these found in the general extension materials within the posters, broadsides, and flyers collection convey the opportunities students had for course selection in the upcoming year. These posters would have been found during class registration or advertised throughout campus in order to promote the available evening classes hosted by General Extension during the 1940s and 1950s. Other procedural material created by the university was hung up across campus to communicate the resources and services available to students. Examples of these posters are those from the Campus Assistance Center from the 1970s, including a poster reading, "Have you found yourself talking to cats lately? Call us or stop by." Or "Caught between Tweedledee and Tweedledum? Call us or drop in." Others communicated how to be prepared in certain scenarios, including this poster stating, "In case of emergency, text you emergency notifications" from 2007. The last type of posters and flyers distributed across campus were those of local businesses, political promotions, and publications. These can be seen in early 1970s advertisements for Sandy's 5-cent donut days and the ever-lovin' chicken steak restaurant here on the West Bank, or through this political advertisement for Mark Dayton, who ran for U.S. Senate in 1982. Other distributions included the locally produced Gave You, one of the earliest GLBTQ magazines, and a flyer for an event hosted by the Evangelical Crusaders Incorporated, both from 1971. These flyers encourage students in the campus community to engage themselves with non-university entities that actively want them involved outside of class. Over time, these types of posters and flyers that were disseminated on campus, either through the campus bulletin boards or through the mail, found its way back to the University of Minnesota archives. Archivists before us were collecting or saving these pieces of communication as a way to document how students, faculty, and the campus community, both internally and externally, were interacting with one another and to essentially illustrate how information was being shared amongst one another. Today, after compiling these materials, the University of Minnesota Archives is working towards continuing these efforts by working with student groups that are active on campus. The services provided to these organizations and individuals who are still posting their sponsored events or informationals throughout campus. This will also include born digital representations of such posters and flyers that may be shared through email or on social media. In the spring of 2023, University of Minnesota Archives submitted a proposal for a strategic digitization project to have the posters, broadsides, and flyers produced by student groups digitized and has started physical scanning this fall with the projected completion date by the end of the year. Ultimately, it can be seen through this presentation that the act of communicating and disseminating information through posters, broadsides, and flyers can be seen on the University of Minnesota's campus throughout time. Even today, just step outside of Anderson Library and you will notice the kiosk while walking across campus. Thank you.